Erev Tov. This week's Parashat Tetzaveh, the Torah describes for us the big day kahuna that Aaron and his sons wore in the Mishkan, and later the Kohanim wore in the Beit HaMikdash, in the Beit Rishon, the Beit Sheni. So there are a number of ideas here. First idea is that there's a uniform to wear. Excuse me. The Gemara says that Mechusar Begodim, a Kohen that didn't have the proper dress, so avodaso psula. So even if he did all of the ritual of the korbanot correctly, and he had the highest, most noble intentions, and nevertheless, the avodah was not acceptable because he was not wearing the proper garments. So there's a concept that in our time, it's become less, I don't know what word to use, less accepted. But there was always a concept of special clothing for certain purposes. And that existed in the general world as well. Our world became a casual Friday. Became that doesn't make a difference how you're dressed. But we retained the idea, for instance, regarding Big Day Shabbos. One has to have special clothing for Shabbos. And Big Day Yom Tov is even more than Big Day Shabbos. In English, there used to be a phrase that said, clothing makes them a person. So there were four basic garments that all of the Kohanim wore. There was a ketonet, a tunic that fit over the body. According to the description in the Gemara, it went almost to the knees of the Kohen. And it was tashbeitz. It was like different squares, and it was made of linen. Now, one of the interesting things about the Big Day Kahuna is that they were shatnez. Because another garment that he wore was avneit, was a belt. And it was made from tcheles, argomon, b'tala shoni, v'sheish. Sheish is linen. The tchelet was from wool. So the Mepharshim point that out. There's a famous Gemara. The Gemara is the name of a woman, Yilta, was the wife of one of the great Rabbonim. She was a great woman in her own right. And she said, Kol Masha Osar Torah, everything that the Torah answered, the Torah was matir somewhere else. So that we should not think that there's a magic in this. That if you wear shatnez, it's, so to speak, harmful to you. It gives off radiation, whatever. So shatnez is awesome. But for the Kohen, it was mutter. And there are many other ideas like that introduced in the Torah. So she already spoke about the fact that there was a fish that if you ate it, it tasted like non-kosher meat. It's the origin of bacon bits or whatever. So that's always was a discussion in halacha. Something can be mutter, but nevertheless, if you let it happen, people may get confused. So where do you draw the line? So the Kohen had this ktonet tashbeitz, and he had an avneit, and he had a belt. And the purpose of the belt always is shelo yehi libo roeh so erva, to differentiate between the upper body of the person and the lower body of the person. So there, throughout the ages, Tosfos discusses this. About today we call it a gartel, right? Chassidim, they always daven with a gartel. It's a special belt. They wind it around their waist. Shelo yehi libo roeh so erva. Tosfos mentions already, Tosfos in the 12th century, Tosfos says now that men wore trousers. There was a time when people did not wear trousers, they didn't wear pants. So then Tosfos said you have to have the belt. But now Tosfos says that people wear trousers, so that's sufficient to remove the problem of libo roeh so erva. There's a second din that the Gemara brings here. There's a posuk, hikon likras elokecha Yisrael. Prepare yourself when you are going to encounter kaviyachol Rabbanu Shalom, meaning for tefillah. You're going to pray. So you have to prepare yourself. How is this preparation done? So again, Tosfos says that in the time when they didn't wear trousers, that was part of the belt. By putting on the belt, it was not only to prevent libo roeh so erva, it also was in order to fulfill hikon likras elokecha Yisrael. So what do we do bizman hazeh? So from there came the idea, excuse me, the idea of wearing a jacket, buttoning your jacket, doing a minor thing that's hikon likras elokecha Yisrael. So in the yeshiva world, for instance, so we're wearing a jacket for davening is, that's the uniform. However, in the general Jewish public, especially here in Israel, so then it became a question of what to do for hikon likras elokecha Yisrael. So it's discussed in the poskim. Straighten your garment, do something. Others say hikon likras elokecha Yisrael is mentally. Prepare yourself, know that you're davening. Don't ignore what you are doing. In the morning when we wear tefillin for Shmoneh Esrei, so to straighten the tefillin before we start the davening, so that's also hikon likras elokecha Yisrael. Anyway, so we have the ktonet and we have the avneit, the belt. Then they wore trousers, michnasayim. which were down to past the knees. And it was made of all of this was made of linen, white linen. It was called the Bigdei Lavan, the white garments. And then the fourth garment that all the Kohanim wore was the hat, the mitznefes. Now the mitznefes was not a hat. What it was a long piece of linen cloth that they wound around their head in a way that it became a turban. And it sat on their head. And since the Kohanim wore tefillin all day, so it had to be placed in a position where it did not interfere with the tefillin shel rosh that the Kohen was wearing. So those were the four basic garments that all Kohanim wore. The Kohen Gadol had four additional garments that he wore. They were called the Bigdei Zahav because there was gold involved in all of them. And for instance, in the Avodah of Yom Kippurim, which we recite in the Musaf prayer, the Kohen Gadol changed 5 times. And every time he changed, he went to the mikveh. And sometimes some of the avodah he had to do with the Bigdei Zahav, and some of it he had to do with the Bigdei Lavan alone, only with the 4 garments. And the 4 additional garments, the Bigdei Zahav, so one was the tzitz, which was on his forehead, a gold plate, and it said on it, Kodesh LaHashem, it had the Shem HaMeforish on it. It's a machlokes in the Meforshim, how it was written. Because there's a question, they couldn't be written exactly in the same lettering because the Shem HaMeforish had to be bigger and higher, taller. So there are different shittas as to how the words Kodesh LaHashem were written on the tzitz. It was also a question whether or not it was engraved in the tzitz itself or whether it was boleit, whether it stood out. But that was, it was attached, it was like the corona mask, it's attached with psil tcheles and kept on the forehead of the Kohen Gadol. So the Kohen Gadol had this hat. And by the way, his hat was taller and different. It was the same piece of linen, except they made it differently so that the turban appeared different. And then he had film, and then he had the tzitz. Then he had the ephod. So Rashi, famous Rashi here, he says he doesn't know what the ephod looked like. He had no tradition. And then he says, one of the most famous statements, he says, V'libi omerli. My heart tells me that this is what it looked like. That it was an apron, shoulder straps, and that it had a belt from the same material made from the apron. That was called the cheshev ephod. Rashi says it's like the apron that the noble women wear when they ride horses to prevent them from getting splattered with mud. So on that, the famous story, a legend, that Rashi was sitting in the Beis Medrash learning, and that a bunch of noblemen and noblewomen passed outside on horses, and it was a big tumult. So Rashi went to the window to close the window, and he looked outside and he saw this noblewoman on the horse. And he said, how come I saw this woman on the horse? And then he said, oh, look what she's wearing. Oh, the Rebbe Shalom sent me the picture of the ephod. And that's what he says, Levi Omerli, that was the ephod. Attached to the ephod was the choshen, which was the breastplate that had the 12 stones of the tribes of Israel. And it had cloth. Half of it was cloth and half of it were the stones. So it was folded, the cloth, the backing to the stones. So there was like a pocket between the stones and between the cloth. In the pocket was the Shem Amforosh, and that generated the Urim V'Tumim. That if you ask the question, the stones lit up in a certain order, the letters, and the Novi was able, or the Kohen was able to read what the answer was. And then the fourth item that he wore, the big day Lavan, the big day Zov, was the meal. He had this sleeveless overcoat. On the bottom, it had tufts of wool and bells. And I discussed with you earlier in the week the idea Nishma Kolo Bevo El HaKodesh. So this was the uniform of the Kohen Gadol and of the regular Kohanim. And again, if they were Mechuser Begodim, then the Avodah Psula, we don't have a vestige of it left. But there are many replicas that have been made. There's a sefer called Melechus HaMishkan, beautiful sefer, in which a Jew remade all of the kelim of the Mishkan and all of the Big Day Kahuna with spectacular color photographs and published it to give someone an idea, at least, of the glory, because it says L'chovod u'letiforos. The uniform was one of honor and of glory in the service of Hashem. Reb Chananya ben Akash Omer, what's HaKadosh Baruch Hu v'zakot Yisrael lefichach hiber lahem Torah mitzvos shenemar Adonai chavei tzaman tzidko yagdil Torah v'yadir.